So technology has continued to evolve this year, like in many other years. The aim to make our lives better and easier. 2023, as I say, no different from previous years as far as what we've seen in the technological innovation landscape. Let's talk about this year's trends. I'm joined tonight by Mudiwa Gavaza, who is a technology economist. A very good evening to you, sir. Thank you so much for coming in on Christmas Eve, no less. Let's talk about your top picks for this year.
Yeah.
What stood out?
So there's a couple of things. Good evening, Tebekile. I think the one for me that I would begin with is generative AI, right? I think 2023 was definitely the year of AI, not because it was anything new, but simply because the likes of ChatGPT literally brought this to the fore. And instead of getting into what is ChatGPT, I think in terms of taking the conversation forward now, one of the things that people have been grappling with towards the last half of 2023, and I think it's going to be a huge thing going forward, is the ethics around, generative AI. We saw some huge turmoil at OpenAI, which runs ChatGPT, around leadership. And a lot of that, outside of the normal boardroom politics, was because there's this grappling at that company about where do we go from here? Is the pace of generative AI are we going too fast with this thing? Are we going to put effective enough guardrails around these things? And I think regulators around the world and technologists around the world are going to be grappling, with this. How far does this technology go?
And how far is too far, right?
Yes, and how far is too far. So I think that was a huge trend this year. People coming to grips with the technology. A lot of companies, organizations, and I've even spoken to schools that were actually making use of the technology, both learners and teachers. And I think going forward, there's going to continue to be, that grappling. So I'd say that was probably the biggest thing, in technology this year. The second piece, for me, I think for now, I'll just leave it at the streaming. Right, online streaming is definitely in a place, where there's a lot of consolidation, that is taking place in the sector. I would actually even ask you, how many streaming services, are you subscribed to?
Too many. Too many is my answer. Way too many at this point. I want to pick up on what you're talking about around ChatGPT and why there are so many ethical considerations around that, because many of those questions persist, right? But, for example, it's gone into so many areas of life. Even recently, there was a claim that even in a government speech, I think a speech by President Ramaphosa, basically, a claim that ChatGPT had been used to write that. What should we be doing and what shouldn't we be doing with that sort of development?
I think what's key is not negating the human being in the process, right? Because there have been a lot of predictions about the fact that, I primarily work, in the newsroom, such as yourself. There were a lot of predictions at the start of the year that we would see jobs, in newsrooms being, at risk because of the likes of ChatGPT and the like. I think recently we saw another, television station here in South Africa launching an AI-powered news bulletin, right? But behind all of that, as much as technology advances and it's good, we need the human being that actually sits and vets what's actually going on, in the background. Whoever was in charge of that speech, sure, you can get the machine to write, an outline for you. But,
how accurate is it, though?
It's not very. Right, and you can see this. Microsoft does an interesting piece because they have something called Copilot, right? And they use it in, Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and if you use it in Internet Explorer, and it actually uses ChatGPT underneath it. But what's interesting the most about that is that it asks you, what I'm about to write for you, do you want it to be imaginative, medium accuracy, or do you want it to be very accurate, right? Which shows you that there is a knowing that these things are not very good. In the AI community, they actually call them hallucinations, where in certain instances you can ask some of these platforms, ask them a question. One of the best things to do is to ask, let's say, for example, who is Tembekile? I promise you.
Well, you don't want to ask a lot of people.
You don't want, yes. But chances are the ChatGPT will be able to pull a lot of information. But in certain cases, it might even tell you things about yourself that you didn't even know. So, you know, those are all the dangers that are there.
So that's frightening. I want to go back to what you're saying about streaming, right?
Yeah.
I remember 6, 7, 8 years ago, we all had at least one streaming service where what it allowed us to do was basically get access basically to TV on demand, right?
Yeah.
Now we've seen just a growth in that space.
Yeah.
Is streaming going to replace traditional television ultimately?
Ultimately, that is what people would want to do. And they would want to do that, you know, from a business point of view, you want that to happen because operating a streaming service typically comes at a lower cost than operating a traditional broadcaster. However, in a country like South Africa, we need to understand our realities here. There are still a lot of people that don't have access to the internet and that still rely on, you know, your satellite dish to have access to television service. A lot of the bunny ears that people have on their TVs, you know, just to access TV. So that will continue to be a problem. It's socio-economical, and when you talk to the likes of MultiChoice, they tell you that, yes, we want people to stream, but we are comfortable that this thing is going to remain. However, the issue is about the number of streaming services that people have. And right now we're seeing a consolidation happening in the market, people coming together because once upon a time it was just Netflix. You had all your streaming, you know, needs catered to on one platform. Then all the studios decided, no, we want in on the action. Then you had Paramount Plus, Disney Plus, Hulu, Showmax, right? And then I think Peacock, all of these different services. But now we're trying to get it back together. So I really think there's a huge opportunity for Showmax in South Africa to actually be pulling in all of this content so that at the end of the day, you pay one subscription and you have access to, you know, all the different streaming content. They've been signing the deals, and I think, you know, that's probably where they're
Let's talk about subscriptions. It's a sore point because what they all seem to have in common at this point is that they all are sick of us sharing our subscriptions or access to our profiles with other people. How far do you think they'll go in trying to get a grip on that?
They'll probably try and go as far as they can. When I say as far as they can, I mean insofar as you're not taking people off the platforms, right? Because the likes of Netflix argue to say that if we discourage password sharing, it's going to help us to actually push up our subscriber numbers, because if Mudiwa and Thembekile are sharing an account and we force them to separate, one of these two people is going to have to get a subscription of their own.
We are broke.
Right? That's the problem now, right? And if you are subscribing for, let's say, all of the different services, plus your internet connection, you know, you're easily going above, because a lot of people often complain about the price of a DStv premium account. But if you do all of them plus your internet, your costs are going a bit too far. DStv has been, you know, wrangling a little bit. You can only stream on 2 devices at the same time in terms of the live broadcast. And they are quite serious when it comes to, you know, some of the password sharing. So they can only go in so far as it doesn't take people away and discourage you and I, because at the end of the day, like you said, consumers are under pressure.
How much of that sort of development and people wanting, for example, to have access to Wi-Fi has to do with some of the companies, especially in the telecommunications space, trying to expand their investment in infrastructure development? Is it linked at all?
It's linked to an interesting extent, and I say interesting because you've got 2 dualities that happen. The likes of Vodacom, MTN, you know, Telkom in South Africa, Airtel, and others on the rest of the continent have done a good job of covering large areas, you know, with their networks. In South Africa, Vodacom and MTN both boast above 99% population coverage. Now, the problem is you have all this infrastructure, but it's not being fully utilized. An interesting stat that people don't know is the fact that on the African continent, average smartphone penetration, because that's the primary way that Africans access the internet, sits below 35%. South Africa is just above that with around 40 to 50%, depending on your data sources.
Unbelievable, right? Because we we assume that everyone has internet access on the go via their phone. Yeah,
and I think part of it has to do with the messaging, because what is true is that 80% of the population in South Africa has access to a mobile device. But how smart is the mobile device in someone's pocket. And at the moment, roughly half of mobile devices, which would translate to the 40% we're talking about earlier on, are actually smart devices. So great infrastructure, but actually getting to a stage where people actually access the internet, because at the end of the day, you spend all these billions. What use of the billions if people aren't utilizing, all of this infrastructure that's there?
Right.
Yeah.
I want to talk to you about the new year, which is in about 2 weeks from now, 2024. What are we likely going to see, either continuing from what we've discussed tonight or any new developments on the horizon?
I'm going to launch off the infrastructure point, right? Because as far as infrastructure goes, there's still a lot of hunger, just for basic connectivity. And I think Elon Musk and the Starlink saga is going to continue to be a huge thing that people talk about into 2024. There'll continue to be a lot of people saying we want Starlink to come into South Africa. Last week, I think MTN revealed that they were in discussions with Starlink and other satellite providers, because basically you are saying let's have satellites in the sky that can help us to plug gaps, especially in your rural areas where you can't have, where it's not cost effective to have fiber. You don't have a lot of network towers. Let's at least have satellites that can help us to bridge those gaps. Think farmers, think outlying schools, rural areas. It's going to be, a huge thing that continues. Ethics around AI, I think that's definitely going to continue to be a big one in the new year. And then I think just an interesting one is fintech, right? Financial technology, people trying to give people access to basic financial services is going to continue. Interestingly, even MultiChoice has entered, into that particular space. And then I think the last one is the fact that, we're going to continue to see that grappling, around the streaming services. What is the best model? Very interesting ones that have come in. There's a company called View in South Africa.
Okay.
They run on they've got two models, but their biggest one is a purely advertising model. They do have a subscription, but that's in the minority. So, all of those different things, have done very well.
Mudiwa, really good to speak to you. Thank you so much. Mudiwa Gavaza speaking to us about the latest in tech, rounding off the best of the best, if you will.